The day humans left, the galaxy began to break. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that settles over a library late at night, or the comfortable silence between two old friends. This was the other kind. The kind that presses against your ears and makes the inside of your chest feel hollow. The kind that only happens when something that was always supposed to be there is suddenly, completely gone. I am Velorath, Senior Archivist of the Galactic Conclave. I have served this institution for over 600 years. I have watched species rise, watched civilizations collapse under the weight of their own pride, and I have recorded every important moment in the long, strange history of this galaxy. I have seen things that would make a younger mind refuse to believe they were real. But nothing in 6 centuries prepared me for the day the humans left. It happened on a Tuesday, or what the humans called a Tuesday. I always found it interesting that they named their days, gave them personalities almost, as if Monday were a different creature from Friday. The human ambassador, a calm and sharp-eyed woman named Claire Alderton, walked into the council chamber at precisely the 9th hour. She carried no documents. She brought no aids. She placed a single data chip on the long obsidian table and slid it to the center without a word. Council Elder Dorath Venn reached forward and picked it up. His gray-scaled fingers moved over it slowly. Then he read its contents on the shared display screen, and the chamber went very still. The chip contained a single document. It was formal, precise, and written in 17 languages. It was a declaration of withdrawal. Every human ship, every human station, every human representative, advisor, and volunteer would be departing conclave space within 30 days. I was sitting in the upper gallery, where the archivists observe council sessions. I had my stylus in my hand. I had been in the middle of writing something, some routine note about a trade amendment, and I simply stopped. The stylus rested against my palm and I forgot it was there. Claire Alderton did not raise her voice. She did not perform, she said, in that steady way humans often had when they had already made up their minds a long time ago that the conclave had made its position clear over many years. Humanity had been passed over for leadership roles it had earned. It had been dismissed in treaty negotiations it had brokered. It had been mocked in closed sessions that its people were never meant to hear, but always somehow did. She said the humans were not leaving out of anger. She said that very clearly, and I believed her, because there was no anger in her voice. There was something quieter and more final than anger. There was decision. Elder Dorath Venn put the data chip down. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked around the chamber at the other council members, 12 species represented at that table, and I watched something pass between them. A look that I can only describe as relief, as if a guest who had stayed slightly too long had finally announced they were heading home. "We accept your withdrawal," Dorath Venn said. "We wish humanity well." Claire Alderton nodded once. She picked up nothing. She left the chamber. The doors closed behind her, and for one breath the room was silent. Then Councillor Peth Alris, the thin and always smiling representative of the Valurian cluster, began to clap. Others joined. It did not become thunderous. It did not need to. It was the sound of a room full of powerful beings who believed they had just resolved a problem they had quietly resented for a very long time. I did not clap. I looked down at my stylus and wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote, "Humans have formally withdrawn from the Galactic Conclave." Then I paused and I wrote one more line that I did not usually include in official records. I wrote, "I am not sure we understand what we have just agreed to." Their ships departed in quiet, organized columns. Their stations went dark one by one, like candles being pinched out across a very large room. Their administrators handed over what records they were required to hand over, packed the rest, and left. There were small parties in certain sectors of the conclave. Songs were written. A Valyrian poet composed a piece called The Breathing Room, which compared humanity's departure to the loosening of a too-tight collar. It was considered very clever. I read it 3 times and felt nothing except a growing unease I could not name. On the 29th day I stood at the observation window of the conclave's central station, and I watched the last human convoy move through the Vareth Gate. It was a modest convoy, 12 ships of various sizes, and the gate swallowed them slowly, ship by ship, until there were none left. The gate held its glow for a moment, and then the light faded, and the space where they had been was simply space. I stood there for a long time after that. The stars did not move. The station hummed around me with its usual sounds. Somewhere behind me, a group of young Kethrani clerks were laughing about something. Everything seemed perfectly normal. But I kept looking at the space where the last ship had been, and I kept thinking about a thing Claire Alderton had said in her very first address to the council, many years ago, when she was a junior diplomat, and not yet the woman who would one day slide a data chip across a table and end an era. She had said it almost as an aside, a small observation at the end of a speech about infrastructure maintenance. She had said, "The things that hold a system together are almost never the things that get the credit." At the time, people had nodded politely and moved on. Standing at that window, watching the empty gate, I finally understood she had not been making a general observation. She had been describing her people. I went back to my desk. I opened my records. I began, with the particular kind of dread that only a very experienced archivist knows, to look very carefully at everything the humans had been doing for the past 200 years. What I found, in those first few days of reading, kept me at my desk long past the hours when the rest of the station went to sleep. I forgot meals. I forgot my evening correspondence. I sat in the pale blue light of my screen and I read. And the longer I read, the more I felt the quiet pressing against me. That same hollow quiet from the council chamber, growing slightly larger and slightly heavier with every file I opened. By the end of the first week after their departure, 2 trade disputes in the Kethrani outer sectors, disputes that had been simmering for 11 years, boiled into something louder and uglier. I noted it in my records and flagged it for council review. The council's response was that these things happened, that trade disputes were normal, and that the conclave had capable mediators who would handle it. I did not argue. I simply noted that the last 3 times those specific disputes had calmed down, it had been because a human trade liaison named Owen Garrett had spent 6 weeks traveling between the 2 systems and talking to everyone who would talk to him. Owen Garrett was gone now. He had boarded one of those 12 ships on the 29th day. I flagged 2 more situations the following week. A navigation relay in the outer rim that was running on outdated calibration data, a small but growing outbreak of a respiratory illness on the station Velkar 9 that had been contained once before, 18 months ago, by a human medical team that had volunteered for the posting because no one else had wanted to go somewhere so far from the main lanes. I filed my reports. I received polite acknowledgments. The conclave, as it had always done, assured itself that everything was under control. I am an archivist. My job is to record what happens, not to decide what it means. But I have been doing this work for 600 years, and I have learned one thing above all others. The most dangerous words in any language, in any species, in any era, are these 4 words spoken together. Everything is under control. I looked at the empty space on my desk, where a small clay figure had sat for 40 years. A human visitor had left it there once, accidentally, and I had kept it because it seemed rude to throw it away. And then I had simply gotten used to it. It was a small, rough thing, shaped like a running figure, one arm stretched forward. I had moved it to the shelf the day the humans left, because looking at it made the quiet feel louder. Now, 2 weeks after their departure, I picked it up again and held it in my palm. It was very light, lighter than it looked. That had always surprised me, no matter how many times I picked it up. You expected something that sturdy to have more weight to it. I turned it over once, set it back on my desk where it had always been, and went back to my reading. The Conclave, in its long and complicated history, had survived many things. It had outlasted empires and plagues and wars that rewrote the maps of entire sectors. It was old, and it was large, and it was, in many ways, genuinely impressive. But it had never, in all its centuries, tried to function without the people who had quietly been holding a third of it together. I was beginning to understand what that was going to mean, and the quiet kept growing. I want to be precise about what I found, because I think precision matters here. I do not deal in feelings, in impressions, or in the kind of vague unease that cannot be measured. So when I tell you what I found in those weeks of reading, I want you to understand that every word of it is supported by files, by mission logs, by communication records, by supply chain reports, and by the thousands of small, unremarkable documents that make up the hidden skeleton of a functioning galactic civilization. What I found was this. Humanity had been carrying the conclave on its back. Not loudly, not obviously, not in a way that anyone watching the surface of things would have noticed. But when you went deep into the records, when you followed the threads back far enough, you kept arriving at the same place. You kept arriving at a human name, a human ship, a human volunteer, a human solution to a problem that no one else had wanted to touch. Let me give you specifics, because I think the specifics are important. In the year 214 of the Conclave's current era, a disease appeared in the Drath sector. It was not a dramatic disease. It did not spread quickly. It did not kill in ways that produced memorable images. It simply appeared in the lungs of the Drath population and made breathing gradually, quietly harder. And the Drath were a proud people who did not like to ask for help, and so they said nothing for a long time. By the time they said something, 43,000 of them were affected, and the medical resources of the Conclave were already stretched thin by a conflict in the Peloran Belt. A human physician named Leonard Cross read about it in a secondary report. He was not assigned to the case. He was not asked to go. He collected 11 colleagues, borrowed a ship from a friend, and traveled to the Drath sector on his own time. He and his team spent a year there. They developed a treatment. They trained local medical staff to administer it. They left behind equipment, medicine, and a protocol document so detailed and clear that even a species with no medical training could follow it. They sent one report to the Conclave when they arrived, and one report when they left. In between, they did not ask for anything. Leonard Cross died, many years later, of old age, in a small house on a planet called Derbyshire. The Drath sent a representative to his memorial. The Conclave did not. I found that story in a file that had been misfiled under infrastructure maintenance for 60 years. That was one story. I found hundreds like it. I found a record of a human engineering team, led by a woman named Patricia Owens, who had spent 4 years repairing the navigation beacon network in the Outer Rim sectors. This was a network that allowed smaller, less technologically advanced species to travel safely through an area of space filled with gravitational anomalies. Without those beacons, ships would be lost. Without those ships, those species would be cut off from trade, from medicine, from the wider galaxy. The beacon network had been flagged as needing maintenance for 11 years before Patricia Owens read the report and put her hand up. She was the only one who put her hand up. Her team repaired 263 beacons in 4 years. They did it in conditions that most conclave engineers would have requested hazard compensation to work in. They filed their final report, noted that 11 more beacons would need attention within the next decade, and recommended that a permanent maintenance crew be assigned. No permanent crew was ever assigned. The humans just came back and did it themselves 7 years later. I found the anti-piracy records. This was the one that kept me at my desk the longest, reading by dim blue light while the station slept around me. The outer trade lanes, the long, slow routes that carried goods between the smaller systems and the major hubs, had always been dangerous. Piracy was a constant problem in those areas, not because the pirates were particularly powerful, but because they were patient, and because the Conclave's patrol fleets were expensive to run, and the outer lanes were not considered profitable enough to justify the cost. So for decades, those lanes had been loosely patrolled and frequently preyed upon. Small merchants were regularly stopped. Cargoes were taken. Occasionally ships went missing and were never found. The humans ran patrols out there. They had been running them for over 150 years. They ran them quietly, without much announcement, without requesting significant conclave resources. They kept their patrol ships older and smaller, because older and smaller ships blended in, and they used that to their advantage. They knew those lanes the way you only know a place when you have spent years moving through it slowly and carefully. Over 150 years, piracy on the outer lanes had dropped by 68%. I found that number in an economics report that had never been connected to the patrol records because they were filed in different departments, and no one had ever thought to look at them together. The economics report had credited the reduction to improved market efficiencies. The humans had never corrected this. They had just kept patrolling. When they left, their patrol ships went with them. The lanes went unpatrolled, and within 8 weeks of their departure, I began receiving incident reports from the outer systems. At first, the reports were small. A merchant stopped and boarded. A cargo vessel that arrived at its destination 2 days late, and with 3 crew members injured. Then the reports began to cluster. Then they began to compound. By the 6th week after humanity's departure, I had 47 incident reports from the outer lanes sitting in my files. In the same period the year before, there had been 4. I flagged this for the council. I included the patrol records. I drew the connection as clearly as I could draw it, which is to say, I drew it in the way an archivist draws things, with dates and numbers and documented sources. I made the argument precisely, and I made it without embellishment. Elder Dorath Ven's office sent a response within the day. The conclave would increase patrol presence in the affected areas. This was being discussed. Resources were being allocated. The situation was being monitored. I put the response in my files and I looked at it for a very long time. Being discussed. Being allocated. Being monitored. The humans did not use those phrases. In 150 years of patrol records, I found almost no instances of a human team saying that a problem was being monitored. They did not monitor problems. They went to where the problems were and they dealt with them, and then they wrote a short report and moved on to the next thing. I began to understand, in a way I had not fully understood before, that this was not a small difference. It was not a stylistic preference, or a cultural quirk. It was the difference between a civilization that ran on discussion and one that ran on action. And the conclave, it was becoming clear to me, had been very good at the discussion for a very long time, precisely because there had always been someone else doing the action. I found the refugee records next. This one I had to sit with for a day before I could write about it. When species were displaced, by conflict, by environmental collapse, by whatever particular tragedy had found them, they needed somewhere to go. They needed ships to move them, stations to house them, resources to keep them alive while longer-term solutions were found. This was, in the most basic sense, what the conclave was supposed to be for. Unity. shared responsibility. No species left without support. In practice, refugee situations were expensive, complicated, and frequently involved species who were not politically powerful and therefore did not generate much enthusiasm in council chambers. Motions were proposed, subcommittees were formed, studies were commissioned. Meanwhile, people needed somewhere to go. The humans went and got them. Over the past century, humanity had quietly absorbed 11 separate refugee populations from displaced species. Not absorbed in the way of conquest, but absorbed in the way of a neighbor who opens their door during a storm. They had taken in populations ranging from a few thousand to, in one case, nearly 2 million people, on an emergency basis. In most cases, these populations had eventually been resettled or had returned to their home regions when conditions allowed. But in the critical window, when the council was still forming subcommittees, the humans had already shown up with ships. There was a woman in these records who I found mentioned again and again. Her name was Grace Pemberton, and she appeared to have spent most of her adult life coordinating refugee responses for the Human Conclave mission. She was not famous. She had no monument. She was in the records because she filed thorough reports, and her reports were a window into years of work that most of the galaxy never knew was happening. I found one report of hers from 40 years ago, filed during a resettlement crisis in the Cathari borderlands. At the end of the report, after pages of careful documentation about ship numbers and resource allocations and medical needs, she had written a single personal note. It was unusual for her. Her reports were almost always purely factual. But at the end of this one she had written, "I want to note for the record that the families we are resettling are frightened but resilient. They deserve better than the situation they have been placed in by inaction. I hope the next generation of conclave leadership will have the courage to act before the crisis instead of after it." That note had been sitting in an archived file for 40 years. No one had responded to it. I read it 3 times. Then I added it to the growing document I was building, my attempt to compile everything I had found into something coherent, something I could take to the council and make them understand. But the deeper I went into the records, the more I began to doubt whether the council could be made to understand something this large. The problem was not that the information was hidden. It was all there, filed and dated, and available to anyone who looked. The problem was that no one had ever looked, because no one had ever thought they needed to. The humans were always just there, present, capable, handling things. They were like the air cycling systems on a space station. You did not think about the air cycling systems. You breathed, and the air was there, and you lived your life, and the systems kept working. You only thought about the air cycling systems the day they stopped. By the 8th week after humanity's departure, I had compiled a document that ran to 412 pages. It covered infrastructure, medicine, patrol operations, refugee support, ecological monitoring, navigation maintenance, and a dozen other areas. I had cross-referenced every piece of data I could find. I had tried to calculate, as accurately as the records allowed, what percentage of the conclave's actual functioning had depended, directly or indirectly, on human effort. My estimate was 41%. I want to be clear about what that number means. It does not mean humans had done 41% of the things the conclave did. It means that 41% of the things that kept the conclave working, the quiet, unsexy, unglamorous, difficult, thankless things that had to be done for the whole structure to hold together, had been done by humans. And they were gone. I sent my document to Elder Dorath Ven's office with a cover note that was, by the standards of my usual correspondence, rather urgent in tone. I used the word critical twice, which was unusual for me. but I used it twice. It suggested that I might wish to take some time away from my desk, as it seemed I had been working very hard. I read that response in the same blue light that had been keeping me company for weeks. I read it slowly, the way you read something you want to make sure you have understood correctly before you allow yourself to react to it. Then I got up, walked to the observation window, looked at the stars for a while, and made a decision. If no one was going to listen to my document, I was going to have to do something an archivist almost never does. I was going to have to leave my desk. I was going to have to go and find the humans myself, and ask them to come back. And I was going to have to do it before the galaxy finished doing what it had been doing, slowly and steadily, since the day they left. Breaking apart. I booked passage on the next available transport headed toward the Verath Gate. I told no one where I was going. I left my 412-page document on my desk, with the small clay-running figure sitting on top of it, one arm stretched forward. Then I left to find the people the galaxy had spent 200 years taking for granted. The conclave, in the 10 weeks since humanity's departure, had not collapsed. I want to be clear about that, because the way I have described things might suggest a sudden and dramatic fall, and that is not what happened. Civilizations do not usually fall suddenly. They do not tip over the way a glass tips off a table. They erode. They develop small fractures that widen slowly, and the people inside them keep telling themselves that the fractures are normal, that the structure is still solid, that there is no real cause for alarm. This is what the conclave was telling itself when I left for the Verath Gate. And this is why I did not sleep well during the 3-day transit, because I knew what the records said, and the records said that erosion, once it begins, does not stop on its own. When I boarded my transport, I had filed my 47th piracy report from the Kethrani outer routes. By the time I reached the gate, my communications system, which I had set to alert me to new filings in the relevant categories, had notified me of 7 more. 54 incidents in 10 weeks. The Council Patrol reallocation that had been promised was still being discussed. Resources were still being allocated. Somewhere in the deep routes between Cathar and the Peloran Belt, small ships were being stopped by people who had quickly realized that no one was watching the lanes anymore. On the 2nd day of my transit, I received a forwarded report from the Station Medical Division on Velkar 9. The respiratory illness I had flagged weeks earlier had been contained. But contained in this case meant that 340 people had gotten significantly worse before a medical team had been assembled and sent. The team was competent. The team had done good work, but they had taken 6 weeks to be assembled and dispatched. Because assembling and dispatching a medical team required subcommittee approval, resource allocation, and a formal request from the Velkar 9 station administrator, who had not filed the formal request promptly because she had not known there was a formal request process. The human medical team that had handled the previous outbreak 18 months ago had not needed a formal request. They had read a mention of the early illness in a routine health monitoring update, which was itself a kind of monitoring that I now suspected only humans actually read, and they had shown up on their own initiative with medicine and equipment within the week. I recorded all of this in my personal log as my transport moved through the quiet dark toward the Varath gate. I was not sure why I kept recording things. Old habits of an archivist, perhaps. Or perhaps I understood, somewhere in the part of me that had been doing this work for 600 years, that what was happening now was something that needed to be recorded very carefully, because it was going to matter later. On the third day, 3 hours before we reached the gate, I received news from the Kethvaros system. Kethvaros was a small planet in the mid-rim, unremarkable in most respects except that it sat at the edge of a region of space that occasionally produced unusual biological material, carried by slow-moving debris fields, that had a tendency to interact badly with certain atmospheric compositions, the kind of interaction that, left unchecked, could develop into something dangerous. The humans had been monitoring Kethvaros for 32 years. I found the monitoring records in my earlier research. A small human team, rotating every 2 years, had maintained a quiet watch on the debris field and on the atmospheric readings of the planet below. They had intervened twice in 32 years, both times quickly. The second intervention, 9 years ago, had been so swift and so contained that the people living on Kethvaros had never known anything had happened. The human monitoring team had departed with everyone else 10 weeks ago. No replacement team had been assigned. No automated system had been put in place. The report I received on the third day of my transit said that Kethvaros was experiencing an unusual atmospheric event. It was being described, in the carefully understated language of conclave medical reporting, as a developing respiratory phenomenon affecting a growing portion of the surface population. I read that phrase and I translated it in my head without difficulty, because I had been reading conclave reports for 600 years, and I knew the difference between what they said and what they meant. What they meant was, something was wrong on Kethvaros. It was spreading, and no one had been watching closely enough to catch it early. I put my handheld device down on the seat beside me. I looked out the small window at the stars moving past. I thought about the file I had found 2 weeks ago, in which the human monitoring team leader for Kethvaros, a quiet man named Arthur Bell, had written in his last report before departure. Recommend continued atmospheric watch for a minimum of 6 months. Debris field activity is slightly elevated. Risk remains low but should not be left unmonitored. Recommend is not the same word as will. Arthur Bell had made a recommendation. He had done his job. He had left it in the hands of a system that received recommendations and filed them in folders and did not always turn them into action before something became a problem, rather than a risk. By the time my transport reached the Varath gate, I had made a list. I had not planned to make a list, but my hands had made it without asking permission from the rest of me. It was a list of every active situation I was tracking that had either been directly caused by humanity's departure or significantly worsened by it. The list had 19 items on it. I had been gone from my desk for 3 days. I put the list away and I went through the Varath gate. The other side of the gate was different in the way that places are different when the rules have changed without being announced. The space was the same space. The stars held their positions. But the quality of things felt altered in a way that I would struggle to explain to someone who had not spent 600 years developing a sense for how places feel when they are moving in a wrong direction. There were more human ships than I had expected. The area beyond the gate, in the first few light hours of what the humans had always called the threshold, was busy with traffic, ships moving in purposeful patterns. A small station had been established, clearly recent, its lights fresh, and its lines not yet worn by the years. My transport identified itself and was directed to a docking port. I stepped off the ship and was greeted by a young man at the dock, perhaps 25 years old by human reckoning, with a calm face and a name badge that said Owen. I told him I was an archivist from the Galactic Conclave, and that I was looking for someone in a position of authority. I expected this to take time. I expected forms, queues, the usual institutional mechanisms that every large organization uses to slow down individuals who show up unannounced. Instead, Owen looked at me with the specific expression that I had learned to recognize over many years of working with humans, the expression that meant they were already several steps ahead of the conversation, and said, "We were wondering when someone would come. Come with me. Claire is available." Claire Alderton was in a building overlooking the new station's main bay. She was older than she had been on the day she slid the data chip across the council table. Her hair was fully white now, and her face had the deep lines that humans accumulated when they had spent a lifetime in the kind of situations that required difficult decisions. She was standing at a window when I was brought in, looking out at the bay with her hands behind her back. She turned when I entered. She looked at me without surprise, and without the coolness I had half expected. She simply looked at me the way you look at someone you have been expecting, and said, "Velorath." It has been a long time. She had met me twice. Both times, very briefly, at formal council events. That she remembered my name was, I understood, not a coincidence. The humans had always paid more attention to names than other species gave them credit for. I said, "Ambassador Alderton, I need to speak with you." "I know," she said. "Sit down." I had tea brought. I sat. I took the tea. She sat across from me and waited. And I noticed that she did not fill the silence with small talk the way many diplomats did. She simply waited for me to begin. I told her everything. I told her about the Outer Lane incidents, the Velkar 9 outbreak, the Keth Varos situation, and the 19 items on my list. I told her about the 412-page document on my desk, and what it had taken me to compile it, and what it said when you put all the numbers together. I told her about the way the council had responded, and about the careful, polite, useless language they had used. She listened to all of it, without interrupting. She was very still in the way that people are still, when they are not merely being quiet but actively processing everything being said to them. When I finished, she was silent for a moment. Then she said, "How long do you think we have before it becomes something the council cannot simply manage with statements?" I told her I did not know for certain. I told her my estimate was weeks, not months, before the Keth Varos situation alone forced the council into emergency session. I told her that the piracy on the outer lanes was already affecting trade, in a way that would begin to show up in economic data within the next quarter. I told her that in the areas where human navigation maintenance had been keeping old beacon networks operational, I was already seeing the first signs of equipment degradation that would, within months, begin to cause navigational errors in heavily trafficked corridors. She nodded slowly throughout all of this. She did not seem shocked. She did not seem vindicated in a way that pleased her. She seemed tired in a specific way, the tiredness of someone who had known something was going to happen, and had hoped, despite knowing, that it would not. "We knew," she said finally. "We knew before we left what would start to fail. We knew the order of things and the rough timing. That is why I asked our teams to document everything before they left. Not for us, but for this conversation, when it eventually happened. I looked at her. You were expecting someone to come. We hoped someone would come, she said carefully. We were not certain anyone would. There was a real possibility the council would find ways to explain away each problem individually and never connect them to a larger pattern. They have been trying, I said. I know. She was quiet again for a moment. What are you asking me, Veldurath? I had rehearsed this part of the conversation during the transit. I had thought about how to frame the request, how to make it sound like an offer rather than a plea, how to preserve the dignity of both parties in a situation where dignity was somewhat complicated by the facts. But sitting across from her, with the tea growing cool in my hands, I found that I did not want to be diplomatic. I found that 600 years of careful archival language had produced in me a great weariness for saying things in the most comfortable way, rather than the most accurate way. I said, I am asking you to come back. I am asking on my own behalf, and not the council's behalf, because the council does not yet understand that it needs to ask. I am asking because 19 situations are on my list today, and there will be more tomorrow, and because Kethvaros has people on it who are getting sicker while committees meet, and because the outer lanes have merchants who are being stopped by people who know no one is watching, and because I spent 2 weeks reading 4 centuries of records, and what I found was that you have been holding an enormous amount of weight that no one ever thanked you for carrying, and I am thanking you for it now, even if I am the only one, and I am asking you to consider coming back. She looked at me for a long moment. She had the stillness of someone making a calculation, but not the cold calculation of a negotiator, something more personal than that. Then she said, Get some rest tonight. We will talk more in the morning. There are others you need to meet. She had already turned back to the window, but she answered immediately, without hesitation, in the calm and certain tone of someone who had been thinking about exactly this problem for 10 weeks. Our team left 48 hours ago, she said. They were ready before you arrived. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Then I walked out into the corridor and I let out a long, slow breath that I had not known I had been holding. They had already gone. They had sent the team before I arrived, before any official request, before any negotiation. I walked back to the room Owen had shown me, sat on the edge of a narrow bed, and looked at my hands in the dim light. Outside the window of the small station, human ships moved with their usual steady purposefulness, back and forth, building and maintaining and checking and repairing. They had never stopped. Even after leaving, they had kept watching. They had kept the list. I thought about the 412-page document on my desk. I thought about what it would have looked like if someone had compiled it 40 years ago, when there might still have been time to say something, to acknowledge something, before it came to this. I did not sleep well that night, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness from the nights before. Before, I had not been able to sleep because things were falling apart, and I did not know if anyone would listen. Now I could not sleep, because things were going to have to be rebuilt, and I understood, perhaps for the first time in 600 years of archiving, that knowing how things fell apart was not the same as knowing how to put them back together better than they had been before. That, I suspected, was going to take longer than any of us wanted. But for the first time in 10 weeks, I believed it was possible. The morning came early on the station, the way mornings on human-built stations always did. They kept their light cycles firmly tied to a 24-hour rhythm regardless of where they were in space, because they said the body needed it, and they took the needs of the body seriously, in a way that some species found excessive, and others quietly envied. I was awake before the lights brightened. I had my notes in front of me and a cup of something warm that was not quite tea and was not quite anything else, but which Owen had provided with the cheerful confidence of someone who believed warmth solved most early morning problems. Claire Alderton came to collect me herself, which I had not expected. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone whose joints had some years on them but whose intention had not slowed at all. She led me through the station's central corridor and into a large room that looked like it had recently been converted from a storage bay into something that functioned as a meeting hall. There were people already there, perhaps 30 of them, seated in the informal way that humans often sat in working meetings, some in chairs, some on the edges of tables, none of them in the rigid formal posture that conclave sessions required. I saw people of various ages, and I recognized some of them from the records I had spent weeks reading. A tall woman with graying red hair near the far wall was, I was almost certain, the Patricia Owens who had spent 4 years repairing navigation beacons in the Outer Rim. She was older now, but she had the same look that her mission reports had suggested. A person who assessed everything around her the way an engineer assessed a structure, quickly and practically. A compact man with sharp eyes sitting near the door was almost certainly connected to the anti-piracy patrol records. He had the particular stillness of someone who had spent years in small ships in large empty spaces, where alertness was not a habit but a survival tool. I did not see Grace Pemberton. I would later learn she had retired to a small coastal settlement and had firmly declined to be involved in what she called the negotiation I always knew we would have to have, though she had sent a note that Claire read quietly before the meeting began. And what she called. Vel Arath came yesterday, Claire said to the room. She did not introduce me or explain my role. They knew who I was. He told us what we already knew. The question now is not whether we go back. It is how we go back, and what we require before we do. I want to record what was said in that room as accurately as I can, because I believe it is one of the most important conversations I have ever witnessed, and I have witnessed a significant number of important conversations. There was a man near the back, perhaps 40 years old by human reckoning, with the careful expression of someone who chose their words with respect for their weight, who spoke first. His name, I learned later, was Daniel Harlow, and he had been one of the lead coordinators for the Outer Lane patrols. Daniel said, I want to say clearly that going back is not about the conclave. It is about the people the conclave is supposed to serve. The merchants on the outer lanes. The families on Kethvaros. The species we transported in emergency situations. That is what this is about. And I do not want us to lose track of it while we are discussing what we require. Several people nodded. Claire nodded. Then Patricia Owens spoke from the far wall. She said, I agree. And I also think what we require is not unreasonable. It is the minimum that makes the situation sustainable. Because I went back to those beacons twice. I am not interested in going back a third time to fix something that the conclave agreed to maintain, and then did not maintain because no one made it a priority. So if we are discussing requirements, my requirement is accountability. Real accountability, with names attached to responsibilities and consequences that mean something. A woman named Harriet Cole, who I would later learn had been involved in 3 of the major refugee coordination operations, said, I want to add that we should not do this quietly again. I want it documented. I want the conclave's official record to state clearly what the human mission has contributed and why it was done. Not for pride. Because the next generation of conclave leadership should not have to rediscover this from an archivist's private research in a moment of crisis. She looked at me when she said the last part. I acknowledged it with a small nod. The discussion continued for 3 hours. I sat and listened and took notes, and occasionally answered questions about specific situations I had flagged. The questions were precise and practical. They wanted to know the exact state of the Kethvaros situation. They wanted to know how many outer lane incidents there had been. They wanted to know the current status of the beacon network degradation I had identified. I answered everything they asked as completely as I could. At the end of the 3 hours, Claire summarized what the room had agreed on. The conditions were not punitive. They were not designed to humiliate the conclave or to extract an apology for its own sake. They were structural. They were the kind of conditions that an engineer would design, conditions that fixed the underlying problem rather than treating the symptom. The humans would return. They would resume the functions they had been performing, but they would do so as a formally recognized partner, not a perpetual volunteer. Their contributions would be documented in the official conclave record. Specific areas of responsibility would be assigned with human oversight formally acknowledged, and other species would be required to share those responsibilities alongside them. There would be a knowledge transfer program, a systematic effort to ensure that what the humans knew was not locked inside human heads and human files, but distributed across the conclave, so that no single departure could create this kind of gap again. And there would be a seat, a permanent, full, voting seat on the High Council, with the same weight as any other seat. Not an advisory position, not an observer role. A seat. Claire looked at me when the list was complete. She said, "Can you take this to the council?" I said I could. She said, "Do you think they will accept it?" I thought about this honestly. I thought about Elder Dorath Venn and his careful diplomatic face. I thought about the 19 items on my list, and the fact that by now it was almost certainly longer. I thought about the way the council had told me I was working too hard, when what I had been doing was reading the truth. I said, "I think the council will accept it because the alternative is to watch the outer lanes become impassable, and Kethvaros become something that can never be fully managed without your help, and 3 other situations that will develop in the next month, that I have not told you about yet, because I only identified them on the transit here." She gave a short, dry laugh. It was the first time I had seen her laugh. It suited her. 3 more, she said. At least 3 more, I said. She nodded. Then take the list back. And Velorath. She waited until I met her eyes. Thank you for coming. I know it was not a small thing, leaving your desk. The desk will still be there, I said, though it may have more files on it than I left. It will, she said. I expect it will for some time. I left the station the following morning. As my transport moved back toward the Vareth Gate, I sat with my notes and my list and the formal summary of the conditions that I would carry back to Elder Dorath Ven's desk, and I found myself thinking not about the council or the negotiations or the 19, now 22 items on my list. I found myself thinking about Leonard Cross, who had borrowed a ship and spent a year on a planet where people were struggling to breathe, and had never expected anyone to notice. I thought about Patricia Owens, standing on a scaffold in a debris field repairing a beacon that kept strangers safe in spaces they would never name. I thought about Grace Pemberton writing her note at the end of a long report, asking quietly for the courage to act before the crisis. I thought about all the files I had read, all the names I had found in the forgotten corners of 4 centuries of records, all the people who had done enormous things in ways that made the enormity invisible, and I understood with a clarity that felt like the lifting of a weight I had not noticed I was carrying, that the measure of a species is not the monuments it builds or the speeches it makes, or the seats it holds at the tables of powerful institutions. The measure of a species is what it does when no one is looking, when no one thanks it, when no one even knows it is there. By that measure, I had spent 600 years archiving the records of the galaxy, and I had somehow missed the most important story in all of it, because it had been filed in the wrong folders, or not filed at all, or filed under names that no one had thought to look up. I went through the Varath Gate with the conditions folded carefully in my case, and the 22 items on my list, and the long, complicated work ahead of me. And I thought that when all of it was over, when the negotiations were done and the seats were assigned and the patrol routes were active again, and Kethvaros was well, and the beacons were humming, and the outer lanes were quiet, and the galaxy was, imperfectly and incompletely, a little more like what it was supposed to be. When all of that was done, I would go back to my archives, and I would refile some things. I would move hundreds of reports from their mislabeled folders and put them where they belonged. I would create a proper record, cross-referenced and clearly indexed, of everything humanity had done for 200 years without being asked, without being thanked, and without being given any reason beyond their own particular and remarkable nature to do it at all. It would not be a monument. It would be an archive, which is what I know how to make. But I have found, in 600 years of doing this work, that archives outlast monuments. Stone weathers, metal corrodes. But a well-kept record, properly indexed and protected, can survive almost anything. And this one, I intended to protect very carefully. The council accepted the conditions. Not immediately. There were 3 weeks of what the official records would later call intensive diplomatic negotiations, which is the conclave's formal way of saying that Elder Dorath Ven and 7 other senior council members had a great many meetings, in which they said the same things to each other, in increasingly tired voices, while the outer lane incident reports kept arriving, and the Kethvaros situation deepened, and the beacon network in Corridor 7 developed its first confirmed navigational error, resulting in a cargo vessel arriving 11 hours late, and its crew filing a formal complaint that ended up, by the particular bureaucratic logic of the conclave, on the desk of the subcommittee that was still discussing the patrol resource reallocation. Something about that specific cargo vessel report seemed to land differently than everything else I had filed. Perhaps it was the name of the crew member who wrote it. A Kethrani trader named Bav Sol who had been running the Corridor 7 route for 40 years, and who had never, in 40 years, been late. Perhaps it was the specific language she used, which was not the diplomatic language of formal complaints, but the direct and undecorated language of someone who was genuinely confused about why a route that had always been reliable had suddenly become unreliable. She wrote, I do not know what changed in Corridor 7, but something changed, and no one seems to be able to tell me what it was or when it will be fixed. I have been running this route for 40 years. I have never had to ask that question before. I saved that report. I still have it. Whatever the reason, something shifted in the Council's internal momentum after that report. Dorath Venn requested a private meeting with me. I brought the conditions document and my full compiled record. He read the document twice, slowly, in my presence, and then he sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. He said, "You believe all of this is connected, that it is not separate incidents." I said, "I believe it is one incident. I believe the incident began on the day the Conclave told humanity that their vote did not count, their judgment did not matter, and their contributions were not worth acknowledging. I believe everything else that has happened since is a consequence of that." He was quiet again. He was a very old being, Dorath Venn, older even than me. I had always found him difficult to read, which was part of what made him effective as a council elder. But in that moment I thought I saw something in his expression that I had not seen there before. Not regret exactly. Something more like the look of a person who has just realized they left their door unlocked and has returned home to find everything inside perfectly untouched, and is only now understanding how close to a different outcome they came. "Draft the formal acceptance," he said finally. "I will sign it." The signing happened quietly, with none of the fanfare that the departure had inspired. There was no ceremony. There were no speeches. Dorath Venn signed the acceptance document in his office with 3 witnesses, one of whom was me. I signed as the official archival witness. My hand was steady. Claire Alderton received the document via secure transmission. Her response came 12 hours later. It was brief. It said that the first response teams were already moving and that full operational resumption would follow according to the transition schedule her people had prepared. Because of course they had prepared a transition schedule. Because they had known this conversation was coming, and they had already thought carefully about how to do this in a way that minimized the damage from the delay. The human teams came back in waves. The outer lane patrols resumed first. The Kethvaros response team was already on the ground, and the initial reports from that situation were, for the first time, cautiously positive. The medical team from Velkar 9 had never fully left, I later learned. They had been quietly monitoring from a small ship in the system, keeping their distance, but staying close enough to act if things worsened beyond what the replacement team could handle. I did not learn this until 3 weeks after the formal reinstatement. I was going through transition reports and I found a fuel expenditure log for a human medical vessel that did not match any authorized operation. When I traced it back, I found that a team of 4 had stayed in the Velkar 9 system on their own resources for the entire duration of the crisis, eating into their own supply reserves to maintain a watch that no one had asked them to maintain and no one had known was happening. The team leader was a young physician named Ellie Morgan. She was 29 years old. She had been part of the original Velkar 9 response mission. When her team was called back with everyone else, she had filed no objection and made no formal request to stay. She had simply quietly arranged to not go as far as everyone assumed she had gone. I wrote her name down. I added it to the growing index I was building. The knowledge transfer program began in the 3rd month after reinstatement. This was the part that most interested me, professionally, because it was the part that would determine whether any of this had actually changed anything beyond the immediate crises. Claire Alderton had been clear about this from the beginning. The conditions were not designed to create a dependency. They were designed to replace a hidden dependency with something visible and shared. Patricia Owens ran the infrastructure portion of the program. She brought her entire team of beacon engineers back to the conclave. and they spent 6 months working alongside engineers from 11 other species, teaching everything they knew, not in classrooms but in the field, out in the outer rim, hands-on equipment, in the conditions where the knowledge actually mattered. I received reports from those sessions. The one that stayed with me was a note from a young Kethrani engineer who wrote that she had learned more in 3 weeks working with the human teams than she had in 4 years of formal engineering training, and that the most important thing she had learned was not a technique but an attitude, which she described as, "They do not wait for the problem to come to them." Daniel Harlow rebuilt the patrol coordination network and made sure, this time, that the methods and the maps, and the network of informal contacts the human teams had spent decades building, were transferred to a joint database that multiple species could access and maintain. He was thorough about this in a way that I recognized as deliberate. He was making sure the knowledge was not portable in only one direction. If the humans ever left again, or if anything happened to the human teams, the outer lanes would not go dark. That, I thought, was wisdom. Not the wisdom of someone who had been hurt and was protecting themselves. The wisdom of someone who understood that the goal was never to be irreplaceable. The goal was to make the thing work. The council sessions changed. Not immediately, and not in ways that made for dramatic archival notes, but gradually, over the following months, the tone of what was said in that chamber began to shift. It was partly the practical reality of having human representatives at the table, with a vote that mattered. It was partly the ongoing work of the knowledge transfer program, which had a particular effect on counselors from smaller species who had benefited most directly from human support, and who now, for the first time, understood explicitly what that support had involved. But I think it was also, at least in part, the document. My 412-page compilation had been submitted to the official conclave record, as Harriet Cole had requested. It sat in the public archive under the title, An Audit of Unrecorded Contributions to Galactic Infrastructure and Welfare, years 1 through 412 of the current era. It was not an exciting title. It was not the kind of document that most people would choose to read on a quiet afternoon. But it was there, and it was indexed, and it was accurate. And in the years that followed I found, checking the access logs as archivists do, that it was read far more often than I had expected. Not by council members mostly, by students, by researchers, by young people from a dozen species who were studying galactic history and had found, tucked into the bibliography of some other document, a reference to this strange and enormous audit that some archivist had put together in a moment of desperate clarity. Some of them wrote to me, not many, but some. A Kethrani student wrote to ask if she could interview me for her thesis. A young Valyrian historian wrote to say he had spent 3 months cross-referencing my document against other records and had found 14 more significant human contributions that I had missed. He attached them, carefully documented and sourced. I added them to a revised edition and thanked him by name in the acknowledgments. That acknowledgment, I later heard, caused some discussion in Valyrian academic circles, because Valyrians did not typically receive acknowledgments from conclave archivists. I found this mildly satisfying. In the 18th month after reinstatement, Claire Alderton came to see me at my desk. She was making a tour of the central station before returning to the threshold for what she called a decompression period, which I understood to mean a rest, though she seemed congenitally incapable of fully resting, and I suspected the decompression period would involve rather a lot of work done quietly by the sea. She stood in front of my desk and looked at the small clay-running figure sitting on top of a stack of completed files. The The stack was smaller than it had been. The list of active situations had contracted significantly. There were still 6 items on it, because there were always items on a list like that, the world being the complicated and imperfect thing it was. But 6 was different from 22. "You kept it," she said. "It belongs here," I said. "It has been on this desk for 40 years. She smiled at that, a small and genuine smile. She said, "How is the archive?" "Growing," I said. "I have begun a new section. It documents the transition period, the knowledge transfer program, the Joint Patrol Coordination records, everything that came after." She nodded. "Make sure it is indexed so someone can find it without having to spend 2 weeks in the wrong folders." "That," I said, "is already my highest priority." She laughed, and then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Do you know what I think was the most important part of all of this? Not the negotiations, not the conditions, not even the knowledge transfer." I waited. She said, "Someone came. Someone left their desk and crossed the gate and sat down across from us, and said clearly, 'You were doing something important, and we did not see it, and I am sorry.' That was the thing that mattered. Everything else was logistics." I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I only came because the list had 19 items, and the Kethvaros situation was deteriorating." "I know," she said, "but you came." She left the next morning. I went back to my archive. The list had 6 items. The outer lanes were running quietly. Corridor 7's beacon had been repaired, and the replacement schedule was in 3 different databases managed by 3 different species. Ellie Morgan was now running the Velkar 9 medical station, having been assigned formally to a position she had essentially already been performing. She had requested a larger supply depot. The request had been approved within the week. I sat at my desk in the blue light of the morning cycle, and I thought about what Claire had said, about someone coming. I wondered how different things might have been if someone had come sooner. If, 40 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 100 years ago, someone had stood up in that council chamber and said, "Wait. We are not giving credit where credit is owed. We are taking something enormous for granted. We are going to lose this if we are not careful." But that is the kind of thought that archivists are not supposed to entertain for too long. Because the record is the record, and the past is what it is, and what you can do is only what you can do in the present. What I could do was this. I could keep the record. I could keep it carefully and completely, indexed so that nothing important was buried in the wrong folder, labeled so that anyone who needed to understand what had happened could find it without 2 weeks of desperate reading by dim light. I could make sure that the next time someone needed to understand what held the galaxy together, they did not have to discover it in a moment of crisis. I could make sure the story was there, complete, waiting to be read. That is what an archivist does. The galaxy was imperfect. It would always be imperfect. But it was functioning. And it was functioning better than it had before. And the reason it was functioning better was not because of a grand moment, or a dramatic reversal, or a single decision made in the full light of certainty. It was because a woman named Claire Alderton had slid a data chip across a table with a steady hand, and waited to see if anyone would finally pay attention. And because Leonard Cross had borrowed a ship. And because Patricia Owens had spent 4 years in a debris field. And because Grace Pemberton had written her note at the end of a long report that no one had answered for 40 years. And because Ellie Morgan had quietly not gone quite as far away as everyone assumed. And because Daniel Harlow had built the patrol network in a way that made sure its knowledge could not leave with the people who built it. And because one old archivist had left his desk for the first time in decades, and crossed a gate and taken a cup of tea he did not drink and said, "I see you. I see what you have been doing. I am sorry it took this long. I am asking you to come back." 600 years of records. 600 years of names and dates and documented facts. And what I had learned, in the end, was that the most important thing in any record was not the event. It was the people who showed up for it. quietly, without being asked. Every single time,